The house felt emptier the day after the funeral. Not because the rooms were large, or because the furniture had been moved, but because Mary was gone. Thomas Hale stood quietly in the kitchen, staring at the mug she used every morning. It was still sitting beside the coffee maker where she had left it 3 weeks earlier. He hadn't moved it. He couldn't. 42 years of marriage had a way of filling every corner of a home. Every sound, every routine, every small habit was a reminder that two lives had once been woven together. Now it was just silence. Thomas was 67 years old, and suddenly he was alone. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the small kitchen table where he and Mary used to eat breakfast together every morning. The chair across from him stayed empty. Footsteps echoed from the hallway. Thomas looked up. His stepson, Daniel, leaned against the doorway. Daniel was in his late 30s, tall, well-dressed, and always carrying the impatient expression of someone who believed the world owed him something. Thomas had helped raise him since he was 8 years old. But over the last decade, the distance between them had grown wider with every passing year. Daniel crossed his arms. "We need to talk." Thomas nodded slowly. "I figured." Daniel walked into the kitchen and sat down. "This house belongs to Mom," he said bluntly. "And now that she's gone, it belongs to me." Thomas looked down at his coffee. He had already seen the paperwork. Mary had bought the house before they were married. Legally, Daniel was right. Thomas didn't argue. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quietly. Daniel sighed. "That's good, because the truth is, I'm selling it." Thomas looked up. "So soon?" "The market's hot," Daniel said with a shrug. "I've already got buyers lined up." Thomas nodded again. "And you want me to leave?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Yes." The word hung in the air between them. Thomas stared at the table for a long moment. "I'll need a little time," he said. Daniel shook his head. "The buyers want the house empty by next week." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. "Next week?" "I'm sorry," Daniel said, though his tone suggested he wasn't. "But business is business." Thomas stood slowly. "I understand." Daniel seemed slightly surprised that there was no argument. No shouting. No pleading. Thomas simply walked down the hallway to the bedroom he had shared with Mary for decades. He opened the closet and pulled out an old suitcase. Inside the dresser were the few things that truly belonged to him. Clothes. Photographs. A small wooden box containing Mary's wedding ring. He packed quietly. By the time the sun set, the house looked almost the same as it had that morning, except for the empty closet and the absence of the man who had lived there for 40 years. 3 days later, Thomas sat on a wooden bench outside a small diner on the edge of town. His suitcase rested beside his feet. The late afternoon sun warmed the sidewalk, but the air still carried the sharp chill of early spring. Across the street, a realtor's sign stood in front of Mary's house. "For sale, sold." Thomas watched as strangers walked through the front door. He wondered if they would notice the small scratch on the kitchen cabinet where Daniel had once crashed his bicycle indoors when he was 10, where the dent in the porch railing Thomas had accidentally made while carrying lumber 20 years ago. Probably not. To them it was just a house. To Thomas, it had been a life. A waitress stepped outside the diner with a cup of coffee. "Here you go, Mr. Hale." Thomas smiled faintly. "Thank you, Carol." Carol had known Thomas and Mary for years. She sat down beside him. "Where are you headed now?" Thomas shrugged, still figuring that out. Carol frowned. "You can't just sit here all night." "I won't." Thomas took a sip of coffee. "You ever hear about those abandoned house auctions?" he asked. Carol blinked. "You mean the tax foreclosure sales?" "That's the one." Carol nodded slowly. "They sell houses for almost nothing sometimes." Thomas smiled. "Exactly." 2 days later, Thomas stood in the back of a crowded county courthouse room filled with real estate investors. The auction moved quickly. One property after another sold for thousands of dollars. Thomas kept his hands in his pockets. He only had a few $100s saved. Most of it would be needed for food and gas. Then the auctioneer announced the final listing. Lot number 27. 1-bedroom residential structure on Maple Hollow Road. A picture of a small house appeared on the projector screen. The structure looked old. Very old. Peeling paint. Broken windows. Overgrown yard. Starting bid, $99. The room went quiet. Most of the investors looked bored. The property clearly needed major repairs. The auctioneer tapped the microphone. $99. "Do I hear 100? Silence. Thomas raised his hand. $99. The auctioneer nodded. Do I hear 100? No one spoke. Going once. Thomas felt his heart beating faster. Going twice. Still nothing. Sold. The gavel struck the desk. The room barely reacted. But Thomas felt something strange inside his chest. For the first time since Mary's death, he had somewhere to go. Later that afternoon, Thomas drove slowly down Maple Hollow Road. The road twisted through a quiet stretch of countryside lined with tall trees and empty fields. Eventually he saw it. The house. It was even smaller than the picture had suggested. A narrow one-story structure with faded blue siding and a sagging roof. The porch leaned slightly to one side. The yard was filled with tall weeds. Thomas parked his truck and stepped out. The wind rustled through the grass. For $99. It wasn't much, but it was his. He climbed the porch steps carefully and unlocked the front door. Inside, the house smelled like dust and old wood. Sunlight streamed through cracked windows, illuminating a small living room with warped floorboards and a stone fireplace. Thomas walked slowly through the rooms. Kitchen, bedroom, bathroom. Everything looked abandoned for years. Still, the structure seemed solid. He could fix it. He had built most of the additions on his old home himself. Repairs didn't scare him. As he walked back into the living room, something unusual caught his attention. A framed picture hanging crookedly on the wall above the fireplace. It showed an old photograph of the house from decades earlier. But behind the house in the picture, there was something that didn't exist anymore. A large wooden barn. Thomas frowned. He stepped closer. The photograph clearly showed the barn standing about 50 feet behind the house. But when he looked out the window, there was nothing there except grass. Curious, Thomas walked outside and headed toward the spot shown in the photograph. The grass was thick and uneven. About halfway across the yard he stopped. The ground beneath his foot felt strange. Hollow. Thomas stepped back and kicked the dirt gently. A dull metallic sound echoed from beneath the soil. He knelt down and brushed away the grass. Underneath was the corner of a rusted steel door buried in the ground. And judging by the size of it, whatever was beneath that old house was much larger than the house itself. Thomas stared at the rusted steel door half buried beneath the grass. For a moment, he simply knelt there, brushing dirt away slowly with his hands. The metal surface was old but thick, far thicker than any cellar door he had seen before. What in the world, he murmured. He stood up and walked back toward the porch. Inside the house, he searched through the small storage closet near the kitchen until he found a rusty shovel leaning against the wall. Back outside, Thomas began clearing the dirt from around the door. The work took nearly an hour. The soil was packed tight from years of rain and neglect. But slowly the entire outline of the door appeared. It was rectangular and reinforced with thick hinges on one side. A heavy metal handle sat in the center, nearly buried under rust. Whatever this was, it hadn't been opened in a very long time. Thomas wiped sweat from his forehead and grabbed the handle. At first it didn't move. He pulled harder. The hinges groaned loudly as the metal door slowly lifted upward. A gust of cool air drifted out from the darkness below. Thomas leaned forward and peered inside. A staircase descended into a large underground space. Concrete walls lined the shaft. Electric wiring ran along the sides. This wasn't an old root cellar. Someone had built something much more serious under this property. Thomas grabbed a flashlight from his truck and returned to the opening. All right, he muttered to himself. Let's see what's down there. He stepped carefully onto the stairs. The temperature dropped noticeably as he descended. Each step echoed softly in the quiet underground chamber. At the bottom, the flashlight beam swept across a wide concrete room. Thomas stopped walking. The space was enormous, far larger than the small house above it. Steel shelves lined the walls. Large wooden crates were stacked neatly in rows. A long metal workbench sat near the center of the room, covered with papers and tools. It looked like some kind of underground storage facility. Thomas approached the nearest crate. The lid was nailed shut. He grabbed a small crowbar from the workbench and pried the boards loose. The lid popped open with a crack. Inside were dozens of small velvet pouches. Thomas picked one up and loosened the drawstring. Something heavy dropped into his palm. He lifted it toward the flashlight beam. A gold coin, perfectly preserved, stamped with the image of a double eagle and the year 1907. Thomas blinked. He reached into the crate again and pulled out another pouch. Another coin, and another. He quickly checked the other crates. Every single one contained the same thing. Gold coins. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. Thomas sat down slowly on a wooden crate. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. He had paid $99 for a house, and beneath it was what looked like a hidden vault. His flashlight beam moved across the room again until it landed on a small wooden box sitting on the metal desk. Curious, he opened it. Inside was a folded letter. Thomas carefully unfolded the paper. The handwriting was shaky but clear. To whoever finds this room, if you're reading this, it means the house above has finally changed hands. That is exactly what I hoped would happen. Thomas frowned and kept reading. My name is Samuel Whitaker. I built this bunker in 1933 during the worst years of the Great Depression. Banks were collapsing, people were losing everything, and no one trusted paper money anymore. Thomas nodded slowly. He had heard stories about those times from his own parents. The letter continued. So I did the only thing I believed was safe. I turned every dollar I had into gold and stored it here where no bank could touch it. Thomas looked around the vault again. The man had taken that plan very seriously. Unfortunately, I died before I could retrieve it. My family lost the property shortly after, and the land passed through many hands. But I always believed that someday someone honest would find it. Thomas felt a strange warmth in his chest. The letter ended with one final sentence. If that person is you, then perhaps life has decided it's time this fortune helped someone who truly needs it. Thomas folded the letter slowly. For several minutes, he sat in silence, staring at the rows of crates surrounding him. After losing Mary, after being thrown out of the home he had built for decades, he had expected the rest of his life to be small, quiet, lowly. But now, he had just discovered a hidden fortune buried beneath a $99 house. 6 months later, Maple Hollow Road looked very different. The old house had been fully repaired. Fresh paint covered the siding. The porch stood straight again. Thomas sat in a wooden rocking chair watching the sunset over the fields. But the biggest change wasn't the house. It was the small community growing around it. Across the road, several new homes were under construction. Affordable houses for seniors who had nowhere else to go. Thomas had decided early on that he didn't need a massive mansion or expensive cars. After the gold was professionally appraised and sold through proper channels, the total value reached nearly $6 million. More than enough for him to live comfortably. But more importantly, enough to help others. A pickup truck pulled into the driveway. Carol, the diner waitress, stepped out carrying a pie. I figured you might need dessert tonight, she said with a grin. Thomas laughed. You're spoiling me. Carol looked around the property. You know, most people would have kept all that money for themselves. Thomas smiled gently. Mary used to say money only matters if it helps people. Carol handed him the pie. Well, she would have been proud of you. Thomas looked out over the land one more time. A $99 house had given him something he thought he'd lost forever. A place to belong again. And sometimes, that was worth far more than gold.